Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on using SOHO devices. Now, SOHO, what does that mean? SOHO, what does that stand for? Well, it stands for Small Office Home Office. Okay, so it means just that. It means there are certain devices that are explicitly designed for the very small office or possibly even like a home network or home office type environment. Some of the most typical devices would be your cable or DSL internet routers. And that's actually what I have here today that I'm going to demonstrate for you. This entire lesson, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over and we are going to look at how to set up a Linksys router that I have set up here in my home office. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look and we'll go from there. Okay, so what I've done and what we're looking at here is nothing more than an internet browser, right? I've opened up an internet browser because this is how we are going to manage the majority of the SOHO devices that are out there. I should mention, by the way, before we get into any of this, I am showing you one particular device, but each device that's out there has its own uniqueness and its own flavor to its interface. What I can tell you is the general idea behind everything I'm going to show you is pretty much the same on all these devices. And if you know how to manage one, it really doesn't take a whole lot of effort to figure out how to manage a different one. Okay, so even though the one I'm looking at is a Linksys router, I can tell you that I've also had D-Link routers, I've had Netgear routers, I even had, believe it or not, a Microsoft router. Yeah, that's right. Microsoft for a little bit actually made SOHO hardware. Maybe they still do, but I happen to, way back in the early days, I had a Microsoft, and it was a wireless B internet router. Okay, so what I'm going to do here in my browser is I'm just going to type in the IP address of the router, and it happens to be 192.168.1.1. And when I do, it's going to prompt me for a username and a password. So I happen to know that the username, it's actually the default username. You don't really change it on this particular router. It's just kind of set up and it's there. The only thing you can change is the password itself. Okay, and so I know my own super secret password here, so I'll enter that in and I'll click OK. And it takes me into the basic setup page. Okay, so here you'll see there's the setup tab where we have sub-tabs of basic setup, distributed DNS, MAC address cloning, and some advanced routing. There's a wireless tab, and I'm going to click on each of these real quick just so you can see what we have, and then we'll come back and visit some of the specifics. There are some basic wireless settings. We have wireless security, wireless MAC filtering, and some advanced wireless settings. There is a security tab where we can set up some firewall rules and some VPN pass-through. Access restriction tab, which only has one sub-tab, which is the Internet Access Policy. Application and gaming, where we have single port forwarding, port range forwarding, port range triggering, DMZ, and quality of service, or QoS. There's an administration tab where we can look at management, logs, diagnostics, resetting to factory defaults, and firmware upgrades. And the status tab. And under the status tab, we can see the router status, the local network, and the wireless network. Okay, so actually, I'll tell you what, let's start right here on the status tab. Okay, for the router itself, you'll see it shows me my firmware version, current date and time, my internet MAC address. Okay, you'll notice I happen to be on Comcast. That's the internet service provider that I'm using. Okay, so this is the domain that it's a part of. You'll see that I am getting my IP address, and when I say mine, I mean if I'm the router. Okay, so the router is getting its IP address via DHCP from the Comcast cable modem. Here's the IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and the DNS servers that it's using. From there, if I click on the local network, you will see here that I have a local MAC address. Okay, so this is for my internal network now to my home office. Here's the router's internal IP address, and that happens to be the same one that we connected to, right? 192.168.1.1 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. And the DHCP server is currently enabled, and I am handing out IP addresses from, and of course it's on the 192.168.1 network, but from 100 to 149. From there, I could click on the DHCP client table, and it will show me various clients that are connected. So we have all sorts of various devices here in my home office that have been connected to this particular router. There's the wireless network tab, which is going to show me my wireless MAC address, what mode I'm currently in, the SSID. You may remember from the wireless lesson, I actually mentioned how I had a router that was actually called Ed's Home. Okay, so that's the router I pulled out for this. And then there's some other information here, and we're going to actually look at this when we get into the wireless setup. If I jump back to the router tab, I did want to show you, I skipped right past. There are a couple of other buttons here. I can do an IP release and renew. If I know that I've lost my IP address or I'm having a problem getting to the internet, I can, if you've ever heard on a computer of doing an IP config, release and renew to reach out to the DHCP server and refresh and get a new IP address, that's what these buttons are. And refresh is just to update the information. All right, so let's jump back way over here to the setup screen. And under basic setup, you will see here, this is where I determined that my internet connection type is DHCP. If I was given a specific static IP address from my ISP, from my internet service provider, or maybe if this router was connecting via another router, okay, because sometimes you'll have that. I have actually had that in my home office where I have this router connecting to the internet, but then there's a more internal SOHO router that is creating another sub network off of that network. You could go ahead and use different configurations for your external IP address. This is also for the external side, which we will leave blank because everything's done via DHCP. On the internal side, this is where I assigned my internal IP address and subnet mask. When I decided whether I want to also be a DHCP server, meaning if I want to give out IP addresses to all my clients that connect, or whether I want them to get it on their own, this is where I did it here. Okay, I enabled it. Starts at what number? How many addresses are we handing out? I could do reservations. Okay, I know this is kind of some advanced networking stuff if you're not familiar with DHCP, but you can do reservations here as well. You can set a specific lease time. You'll notice that 0 means 1 day, so I'm giving out IP addresses and I'm giving them out for a day. And I can configure static DNS servers if I want to. If I don't, meaning the way it's set up right now, what it's going to do is the clients are going to end up with the same DNS server as the router. So the DNS servers that the ISP gave me. I can also set up the time zone. If I scroll back up here, the next thing I want to jump to is the wireless tab. And this is where the wireless settings were set up. Now we have two options here. We have manual, which is how I'm currently set up. We could do Wi-Fi protected setup. And if I click that button, you'll see here, this is known as WPS, Wi-Fi protected setup. You'll see here that you have a couple choices. If your client has WPS, if it actually has this button on it, and we're talking about all the various devices that are going to connect to your router, then you can click or press that button, and while somebody's pressing that button on the on that other device that's looking to connect, I could click this button right here. Or if the client device has a WPS PIN number, you can enter it here and click register. Or if your client's asking for a specific PIN from your router, okay, you enter this number, and here's all the information. WPS was originally set up as what was supposed to be a really easy way to get devices set up and a secure way to get devices set up. I don't personally see it used a lot. What I see used much more often, and I will say it is secure in the sense that nobody's going to get connected to your wireless network, I mean, other than a true hacker, somebody who really knows what they're doing, or somebody who is with you when you're ready to click this button. Let's look at the manual setup. Okay, this is much more common. Now, this particular router happens to do G and N wireless. Okay, so if you remember from the wireless lesson, we talked about A, B, G, and N. Well, this one does B, G, and N. That's what this particular router does. And the network mode right now is considered mixed, which means it does all of them, which means I'll accept clients from any of those technologies. I could choose to only do B and G and not allow N. I could choose to do G only. I could do B only, or I could not do B or G and do N only. Okay, I pretty much have the choice to do whatever I want as far as these networks. Now, why do I want to do this? Well, again, maybe there's only certain devices I'm using. Maybe there's only certain frequencies that I want to be using. When I was using wireless in my home office and my children were younger, when they were babies, I had baby monitors that were interfering with some of the wireless frequencies. In the past, I've had a wireless camera security system that I had set up watching the exterior of my house, and as that would broadcast, it interfered with some of these frequencies. So that's a reason you may select some of these. Now I'm going to jump down here and I'm going to eliminate N and I'm going to go down to just BG mixed. And the reason why is because, well, I want you to notice that when you're on mixed as a whole, let me cancel the changes. Sorry about that. There we go. Get everything back to the way it was. Everything is pretty much set to auto. And that's one of the ideas behind using the N network. And specifically when you're going to use B, G, and N, this router is configured to say, all right, let me figure out what's best for you across the board. Whereas when you jump away from N and you go to a specific channel, okay, so I'm going to do BG mixed, you'll see here that we're no longer dealing with the radio band because B and G use the same radio band. And there is no wide channel, that's an N frequency only. But we have our standard channels, and I want you to see here that we have channels 1 through 11. Now, why would we want to select a specific channel 1 through 11? Well, the short version is, without going into a whole long explanation as to how the frequencies work in wireless, is that you may have more than one of these routers. I already mentioned that, right? I mentioned I might have one that's connected to the internet, and I might have another one just handling a specific office within my home office. Well, you don't want them to conflict with each other. You don't want them to interfere with each other. And what you need to do to make them not interfere with each other is they need to be at least 5 channels apart. Okay, so if you set one to channel 1, you could set another to channel 6 and another one to channel 11. So those are the 3 most commonly used channels, is 1, 6, and 11. You can use the other channels. The problem is if you use channel 2, the next one would have to be at least channel 7, and the next one after that would have to be channel 12, which doesn't exist, which means you're limiting yourself to only the 2. So that's how you could set up the channel, although if you don't have channel concerns, you could leave it at auto. And by the way, you may be dealing with not just another router, but you could be dealing with some other device altogether. There could be some other wireless device, and it is set to a certain channel on this particular frequency, and that frequency, by the way, was the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, and you then may have to set the channel for that reason. Now, real quick, I want to hit cancel again and set everything back. All right, there we go. The other thing I want to show you is something that I talked about in the wireless networking lesson when I talked about security, which is one very, very basic form of security is SSID broadcast. By having it enabled, what that means is a wireless client is going to see Ed's home. In other words, if you are on a laptop, let's say, and you say, I'm looking to get out on a wireless network, I want to connect to one, show me all of them that are available, it's going to show you Ed's home. If I disable that, the only people who are going to be able to connect to Ed's home are people who know that it exists and manually type it in, as opposed to just saying, hey, show me all the available wireless networks. All right, so we don't want to do that right now. I just want to show you that that's where that feature would be. Now, real quick before I go to wireless security, let me go to wireless MAC filtering, because that's the other one that I talked about with SSID broadcast. I can also set up a MAC filter. If I enable it, then I have 2 options here. I can either prevent the PCs listed below from accessing the wireless network. So let's say I know that I have a specific neighbor who's always jumping onto my wireless network. Well, I could go ahead and enter their MAC address, and they would be denied access to the wireless network. I actually did this once specifically to one of my children. One of my children was being a little bit snotty with me and was insisting that there was nothing I could do to get them off of the internet unless, and as far as they were concerned, they felt unless I wanted to kill internet for myself and everybody else, I couldn't restrict their internet access. Well, that wasn't very difficult. All I had to do was go ahead and look at the MAC address of the laptop that they were using, the one that they were trying to get on the internet with, and I added the MAC address and said, you're now prevented. Everybody else can get in. The other option for MAC filtering is you can permit only specific PCs that are listed. And that would be the more common form of MAC filtering if you're doing it for security reasons. If you know that you have a certain, let's say, 6 wireless devices that you use in your small or home office, and that's all you want to let on the wireless network, you don't want to let anybody else in, well, then you add the 6 MAC addresses here. They all get in. Everybody else does not. Okay, so that's MAC filtering. Go ahead and set that all back the way it was. Wireless security. Let's jump over here. This is where we set up our basic security encryption settings. Again, a lot of this goes back to the wireless networking lesson, and if you did not watch that, I encourage you to go do so because a lot of that refers to what I'm doing right here. Under security mode, you'll see here that I can set up WEP, wired equivalency protection, not wireless encryption protocol, as I joked about in that lesson. If you set up WEP, you'll see here that you can go ahead and create a passphrase, and it will then, from that passphrase, generate a key, and those keys then need to be used when connecting from a client. This was originally considered to be the first form of wireless security and encryption. That's why it was called wired equivalency, but it is easily cracked and is very seldom used today. From there, I have WPA and WPA2 personal, and I have WPA and WPA2 enterprise. Now, again, if you remember from the wireless networking lesson, I mentioned that if you're going to use enterprise, you're also going to have 802.1x configured, and that's what it means right here if I set up radius. So these 3 right here are not actually very common in a small office, home office type network. Okay, that's usually more of the enterprise, which I find ironic that we're using a SOHO device, but enterprise settings. At least the options are there. It's not typical, but the options are there. What you would typically do is set yourself up on WPA2 personal. That's the most secure. Now you may recall that when we first came to this screen, I had mine set on WPA personal. And the reason is because I ran into some issues with some older devices that were not equipped to handle WPA2. You have to keep in mind the clients that are going to be connecting. If you have an old enough client that can't even do WPA, which at this point is almost non-existent, but if you had that, then you'd have to go back and do WEP. Okay, but in my case, I did WPA because I had an older device that couldn't handle WPA2. You'll see here that it's set up for TKIP encryption. You can pick between TKIP and AES. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the encryption strategies. Here's the passphrase, and this is the actual passphrase that one would have to enter onto their wireless client device when they connect to Ed's home. And by the way, that's not the passphrase that I actually use in my home. I configured this all specifically for this lesson. All right, so that's pretty much how you would set up your wireless encryption settings. From there, I'd like to jump over to the security tab and show you that we have some very basic firewall capabilities. Okay, it is extremely basic, but I just want to show you that it is there. Okay, so things like filtering anonymous internet requests, you can filter multicast, filter internet NAT redirection. Okay, so you can protect against certain things. And by the way, if you ever need a further explanation, and this is one thing I do love about this particular router, other routers do have their own mechanisms for this as well, but right here where it says help, I can actually pull up and it will explain exactly what these things are doing for you. Okay, so very cool there. Next, I want to jump over to applications and gaming. And I want to talk to you about port forwarding. This is the idea where you can go ahead and take a port, or a specific application, something that might be coming into your network, and you want it handled by a specific client. Okay, so the example I can give you is there's some preset ones up here at the top. Let's say I have a web server. Let's say I'm actually hosting a web server here in my home office. Well, I could say take all HTTP requests, and then I would need to make sure that that particular server had a static IP address, either through a DHCP reservation or just flat out static IP address. And I could say, hey, if anything comes in via HTTP, go ahead and send it to 192.168.1. And I'll just hypothetically say 200. And then I need to check the box saying it's enabled. And now, if I have to come down here and click Save Changes, by the way, that's a very important thing. If I do all this work and then I click somewhere else, and then I come back, you'll notice it all goes away. Okay, so you have to set it up. You have to say, I want you to do this. I want you to send it to a certain location and enable it, and then save the changes. Now, I'm not going to actually do that because I don't have that web server set up, and that was a made-up IP address that I put in. I'm going to show you that that's how you do it. Now, you can also do port range forwarding. So you could do an entire range of ports. You can say if anything comes in on this range of ports, forward it somewhere. And then there's port triggering. And if we click on help here, you'll see here that what this does is it instructs the router to watch outgoing data for specific port numbers. Okay, whereas port forwarding was for the incoming data, this is for the outgoing data. And what happens is the IP address of the computer that sends the matching data is remembered by the router so that when the requested data returns to the router, it'll go back to that same client. Okay, so this has to do with if you know that you're going to use some specific application and you're going to be going out, so let's say some gaming app uses a specific app, and when the client's using it and it sends the request out to the web, then when the response comes back, the router knows to send it back to that same client. Okay, so that's what that is there for. We have the DMZ tab. And this is kind of an interesting scenario. It's not necessarily a true DMZ. It has to do with basically taking one box, and you determine that one box by specifying the IP address or MAC address of that box. And you're basically putting it out there to have just complete free reign out on the internet. And more specifically, the internet has free reign on it. Because you need to keep in mind that everything that's happening through this particular Soho router is being done through NAT, Network Address Translation. Okay, remember, if I jump over here to the status tab, remember I have an external presence on the internet of 67.184.249.226. Okay, that's an actual live internet IP address. And everything that comes from my home office and goes out to the internet, that's the IP address that the web servers and everything else are going to see. That's where they're going to think everything is coming from. Whereas on the inside, everything is 192.168.1, which is a private IP address and is going to be completely filtered based upon all the settings of this particular router. All right, so if I jump back over here, go to the DMZ, I can set up a specific computer that's going to be more closely accessible to the internet and not as protected by all the various settings that we're going to set up here on the router. The last thing that we can do is QoS, which stands for quality of service. And the quality of service has to do with if you know that you need to give certain priority to certain applications, let's say. Okay, maybe you're doing a lot of Skype and it's coming through very choppy because there's a lot of other stuff going on. But you know that you have that Skype conference call and it's really important. Okay, or if it's a home situation where it's not even an office situation, it's just a home situation, Maybe you're trying to have a communication with a loved one who is, across the country or across the world, and you really want to make sure that that Skype conversation is not interrupted. You can do quality of service to go ahead and make sure that that application gets priority to the internet bandwidth. Okay, that's what quality of service is all about. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind with all this stuff that we're looking at is I want you to keep in mind that this is all very basic. Okay, so everything that we've talked about here when it comes to quality of service, when it comes to DMZs, DHCP, firewall, these things, if you actually go out there and get a real firewall and you have a real router with real QoS and you can set up an actual DMZ, they're much more sophisticated technologies. The idea here is that this is for a small office or home office where you're going to have basic functionality needs. And so for the most part, it gives you the basics, but if you're going to get real sophisticated with it, like you're in the enterprise, then you have to go get an enterprise device. This is a Soho device. And with that, we reach the end of this lesson on using Soho devices. I hope that was beneficial to you. Again, that was one particular device, one particular setup, but once you know how to use the first one, the rest of the Soho devices out there, they all become pretty intuitive on how to use. Okay, I've really never run into one that gave me a real problem once I figured out how to use the first one. All right, so I thank you for watching the lesson, and I will see you in the next one.